up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and clean my throat. to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
Okay, now we got it. Sorry about the extended opening and the double music. Um, I got sidetracked on the way back in here and just didn't make it back in. So bear with me a second. And I will get started on this final reading from the Hiram Key. Come on. Everything's going to be uncooperative now, of course. Bear with me. You've already been bearing with me for 19 minutes, so I guess one more minute isn't going to kill us, is it? Come on. I got to be able to monitor my other stuff that I've got going on, so sorry. Okay. Good enough. Now we can go ahead and get started. All right. So, um, we've already finished all the chapters. I'm going to read the postscript and the appendix. I think those are worth reading. The other appendices are not. They're just like lists of timelines and stuff like that. There are a couple of maps back in there that I might show you, but otherwise, I don't think they're really all that worth getting into. But the main, the first appendix is a lot of information. Um, I'm interested in it. So, postscript. Having started out on some entirely private research, we had got into the habit of keeping everything close to our chest, sharing our discoveries only with one Masonic past master and one Church of England clergyman. They passed comment at various stages and managed to convince us that we were making a lot of sense. We found this immensely valuable because we were too close to our subject to know whether or not we were conveying the excitement and the import of the discoveries we were making at an ever increasing rate. Shortly before making the presentation to our publisher, Century, we decided that it was important to tell the people currently concerned with Rosalind about the content of our book. So one sunny afternoon, we met with the curator, Judy Fiskin, and Bob Bryden, a Masonic and Templar historian connected with the chapel, who proved to be a mine of information. The discussion took 5 hours, but at the end they both felt that we had found something quite remarkable that would have major implications for the future of Rosslyn. Judy duly arranged to meet with Niven Sinclair, a London-based businessman who holds the right to control excavations on the site. 2 weeks later, we met Niven for lunch and once again explained our findings. Over recent years, Niven has devoted a large part of his time and substantial amounts of money to the upkeep and promotion of Rosslyn Chapel, and solving the mysteries of the building has become a driving passion for him. He listened intently to our story and then, with a broad grin, informed us that he had the right given by the current Earl to excavate the vaults. This fascinating and energetic Scot was just the man we needed on our side. A further meeting was then arranged to present our discoveries to a group called the Friends of Roslyn. About 30 people arrived, and once again we ran through our story, keeping to the essential parts that affected their building. The audience included historians, Scottish Grand Lodge members, 2 clergymen, the most senior Knights Templar in Scotland, and Baron St. Clair Bondy, who is a direct descendant of William St. Clair and who has since proved to be a great ally. No one found any reason to challenge our view, and indeed several people came forward to tell us that they had important information that would support what we had just said. However, the night before this presentation, we made one further significant discovery about the secrets concealed in Roslyn. As Chris was preparing the overhead slides, something rather interesting happened. We had previously decided that Rosalind was a spiritual interpretation of Herod's temple, and to see if there was any significant similarity between the two, Chris overlaid the acetate drawing of the foundations of the ruined Herodian temple on top of the plan of the chapel. They were not similar, they were the same. Rosalind is not a free interpretation of the ruins in Jerusalem. As far as the foundation plan is concerned, it is a very carefully executed copy. The unfinished sections of the Great Western Wall are there. The main walls and the pillar arrangement fit like a glove, and the pillars of Boaz and Yakin stand precisely at the eastern end of what would be the inner temple. The spot that we identified as being at the center of the Seal of Solomon turned out to correspond exactly with the center point of the medieval world, the middle of the Holy of Holies, the spot where the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the temple at Jerusalem. The parallels continued outside the building. The land at the eastern end of Rosalind falls away just feet in front of the twin pillars in an identical manner to the site of the original temple. This discovery prompted us to look more closely at the landscape surrounding Rosalind, and we found that the area appeared to have been selected because it reflected the topology of Jerusalem. To the east lies Scotland's own Kidron Valley, and in the south runs the valley of Hinnon. I'm not sure. William St. Clair was indeed a genius. From this new understanding of the surrounding landscape and from further clues found in the building of Rosalind, we believe that we have finally cracked the encoded message left by the Earl, half carved into stone and half interlaced into Masonic ritual. We now know exactly what the copper scroll, the treasure map of the Essenes, and the Templars is hidden. Where the copper scroll, is hidden. And before I go on, that is actually the end of the postscript, except for this one picture. So I'll read it, and then we'll jump into the appendix, or I'll show the picture. So it is Rosalind and Herod's temple, two separate illustrations, one over the top of each other, showing the west wall, the Holy of Holies, Yakin and Boaz. Comparison between the foundations of Herod's temple and the plan of Rosalind. So there you go. Rosalind is the one on top. Very interesting. That is a very faithful copy of at least parts of it. Okay, so Appendix 1, the development of modern Freemasonry and its impact on the world. The English Reformation and the conditions for emergence. From the completion of Rosalind Chapel to the official opening of the Grand Lodge of England on 24 June 1717, the society that had evolved from the Templar Order and was to become Freemasonry conducted its business in secrecy. For reasons of self-preservation, the organization remained hidden from general view until the power of the Vatican began to slide rapidly in the 16th century. This was due to the Reformation, which was a widespread movement within Western Christendom to purge the Church of medieval abuses, reduce papal control, and to restore the doctrines and practices that the Reformers believed conformed with the biblical model of the Church. The Renaissance popes were notoriously worldly, practicing such open abuses of their position as simony. I don't know what that is. Honestly, I've never. Nepotism, I know, and carefree financial profligacy. The church itself was seen to be riddled with the venality and immorality, and this that led to a breach between the Roman Catholic Church and the Reformers, whose beliefs and practices came to be called Protestantism. The Reformation can really be said to have begun in Germany on 31 October 1517, when Martin Luther, an Augustinian university professor at Wittenberg, issued 95 theses inviting debate over the legitimacy of the sale of indulgences. The papacy immediately saw this as a political threat to a profitable international dictatorship and proceeded to label the freethinker as a heretic. Luther's three famous treatises in 1520, an open letter to the Christian nobility of the German national concerning the reform of the Christian estate, the Babylonian captivity of the church, and On the Freedom of a Christian, won him widespread popular support. Luther believed that salvation was a free gift to all people through the forgiveness of sins by God's grace alone, and that it was not therefore necessary to have a pope at all. Not surprisingly, such Jesus-like thinking was not welcomed by the papacy, and he was excommunicated in 1521. But Luther was a very clever man, and in April of that year he stood before Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and the German princes at the Diet at Worms, and refused to recant unless proven wrong by the Bible or by clear reason. Although England had its own religious reform movement based on the ideas of Martin Luther, the English Reformation occurred not to stem papal excesses, but apparently as a direct result of King Henry VIII's personal trouble with his marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The breakaway from papal power was masterminded by Thomas Cromwell, chief minister to the king, who passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals through Parliament in 1533, followed the next year by the Act of Supremacy, which fully defined the royal control of the Church. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, authorized a translation of the Bible into English and was largely responsible for the Book of Common Prayer. The Roman Catholic Church was replaced by the Church of England, though there was a brief reversal during the reign of the daughter of Henry VIII by Catherine of Aragon. Queen Mary I ruled from 1553 to 1558, who had been ditched by Henry because she had not borne him a male heir. Once in power, Mary proceeded to restore Catholicism, re-establishing the traditional services and the authority of the Pope, and earning the epithet Bloody Mary for the executions of Protestants. In 1554 she married King Philip II of Spain, son of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The event sparked several rebellions, which were harshly put down, and afterwards 300 Protestants were burned at the stake for their beliefs. Under her successor, Queen Elizabeth I, England grew into a strong and Protestant nation. The king who built the lodge system. Freemasonry today consists of almost 100,000 individual cells called lodges, each of which has a worshipful master and a full set of officers who are allowed to conduct ceremonies of initiation and advancement. It is possible to trace the development that led to this from the St. Clair family's building of Rosslyn Chapel through to the modern day. It appears that after the building of Rosslyn, the concept of operative lodges, those made up of skilled stonemasons, continued to flourish in close association with the more senior speculative lodges, made up of aristocrats that had been admitted through living resurrection. As we saw, once the building of Rosslyn Shrine was complete, it was not possible simply to dissolve the secret organizations with which these proud stonemasons had been provided. They had their own rights, and a part in an order that linked them with their lords and the mysterious ancient past of King Solomon and beyond. For the next 100 years, these operative masons grew in Scotland as a remote extension of the speculative masons, but eventually the St. Clairs dropped into apparent obscurity, and the origin of the system was lost to living memory. Slowly but surely, circumstances arose wherein the ceremonies were repeated with pride, but no understanding of their origins. King James VI of Scotland, also later James I of England, was the only child of Mary Queen of Scots, and the first king to rule both England and Scotland. He was also the first king known to be a Freemason, being initiated into the lodge of Scone and Perth in 1601 at the age of 35. Born on 19 June 1566, James was only 15 months old when he succeeded his Catholic mother to the Scottish throne, but did not begin his personal rule of Scotland until 1583. He received an excellent education from his principal tutor, George Buchanan, who undoubtedly had a strong influence on the young king. Buchanan himself had been educated at the universities of St. Andrews in Scotland and in Paris, and was a man of great intellect. He had lived in Europe for 30 years, where he developed a reputation for being one of the leading humanists of the age, and has since been considered to be one of the greatest Latin scholars and poets of the late Renaissance. The young king had a good brain, and under the intellectual guidance of Buchanan, James successfully asserted his position as head of church and state in Scotland, outwitting the nobles who conspired against him. Being eager to succeed the childless Elizabeth I to the English throne, he merely made a mild protest when his mother was executed for treason against Elizabeth in 1587. At the age of 37, 2 years after becoming a Freemason, James became the first Stuart king of England, and he devoted himself largely to English affairs thereafter. Although raised as a Presbyterian, he immediately antagonized the rising Puritan movement by rejecting a petition for reform of the Church of England at the Hampton Court Conference in 1604. Roman Catholic hostility to a Protestant monarch was widespread, and in 1605 a Catholic plot led by Guy Fawkes failed in an attempt to blow up both king and parliament. Despite this assassination plot, there was suspicion in England that James was secretly rather pro-Catholic because he had concluded peace with Spain in 1604. James was a speculative Mason and also wrote books about kingship, theology, witchcraft, and even tobacco. Significantly, he also commissioned a new authorized version of the Bible, which is called after him, the King James Bible. It is the version that omits the two anti-Nazarene books of Maccabees. The introduction that still appears in the front of this Protestant Bible reveals no Catholic sympathies. One section reads, quote, "So that if on the one side we shall be traduced by popish persons at home or abroad, who therefore will malign us because we are poor instruments to make God's holy truth to be yet more and more known unto the people, whom they desire still to keep in ignorance and darkness." End quote. This passage betrays a new kind of outlook where knowledge and the people are seen as things that should be allowed to come together, in contrast to the secretive and political selfishness of the Catholic Church at that time. Modern Freemasonry is non-sectarian, and it boasts that it always has been so, but we think there was a period of anti-Catholicism that shows itself in this introduction to the King James Bible. The circumstances of the early 17th century provided the perfect conditions for the secret society of Masons to emerge into the public arena. With the king a speculative Mason himself, and the power of the Pope blocked for all time in Scotland, the need for utter secrecy was suddenly gone. King James was a thinker and a reformer, and he must have felt that the structure of the growing Masonic movement needed to be more formalized. So 15 years after he had taken active control of his Scottish kingdom, 2 years before being accepted as a Freemason, and 5 years before becoming the English monarch, he ordered that the existing Masonic structure be given leadership and organization. He made a leading Mason by the name of William Shaw his general warden of the craft, and instructed him to improve the entire structure of Masonry. Shaw started this major project on 28 December 1598 when he issued, quote, "the statutes and ordinances to be observed by all the master masons within this realm." Signed himself as the general warden of the said craft. And that was end quote. Um, Shaw did not give much thought to the fact these gatherings had originally been introduced by the St. Clair family, who had held what was known as a court of crafts nearly 200 years earlier under the reign of Robert the Bruce. By Shaw's time, it appears that the St. Clairs had lost much of their influence because they had sought to gain financially through their control of operative stonemasonry. Towards the end of the year 1600, a new document was drawn up by the masters, deacons, and freemen of the Masons of Scotland, and issued with the consent of William Shaw, who is described in the document as the King's Master of Works. This became known as the First St. Clair Charter. It states, quote, "From age to age it has been observed amongst us. It is stated that the lairds of Roslin have ever been the patrons and protectors of us and our privileges, but within the past few years, by negligence and slothfulness, the office had passed out of use. This had deprived the lairds of their just rights, and the craft of their patrons, protectors, and overseers, leading to many corruptions in the craft and to potential employers abandoning many great enterprises." End quote. This was signed by officers of the lodges of Dunfermline, St. Andrews, Edinburgh, Haddington, and Atchison's Haven. Despite this dip in the fortunes of the St. Clair family, the Scottish Masons stood by tradition and turned down Shaw's offer of a royal warrant for the order if King James was accepted as Grand Master. Although the St. Clairs had no veto over James appointing himself Grand Master, they had the support of the lodges against him. The ritual of the Shaw lodges was regularized, but it was still fully based on the old constitutions, and the Masons' words and means of recognition were still those of an older verbal tradition, which Shaw indeed refers to on many occasions. He called the gatherings of speculative Masons lodges, and 2 years after his work had begun, the previously secret lodges of Scotland started listing the names of their members and keeping minutes of their meetings. They still did not broadcast their existence, but we can easily identify them today. The geographical location of the first registered lodges show how the rituals cemented at Roslin by William St. Clair became a major movement during the reign of James VI. Wow, excuse me. It was a regulation of both operative and speculative masonry by William Shaw, James VI's General Warden of the Craft, that formalized the ritual into what we now know as the 3 degrees of craft masonry. He did this by reestablishing the separate operative masons as junior subsidiaries of the speculative masons, thereby creating incorporations for the stonemasons, each of which would be attached to a lodge of speculative masons. An absolute requirement of membership of a speculative lodge was that a candidate had to be a freeman of the borough in which the lodge was situated, and soon a speculative mason was distinguished from an operative mason by the title Freemason. Every incorporation was required to be attached to a lodge, but every lodge of speculative masons did not have to have an incorporation. From this point onwards, Freemasonry had a lodge structure which would soon spread to England and eventually the entire Western world. The architects of the second degree. We believe that the current content of the 3 degrees of craft Freemasonry was largely present in just 2 degrees prior to Shaw's reorganization that inserted an extra level of speculative masonry. In between entered apprentice and Master Mason, which was originally known as the Master's Part. This new degree was introduced and designated the Fellow Craft, derived, we think, from the fact that these Masons were not workers in stone, but workers in the Fellow Craft of speculative Masonry. We are now sure that this degree was a development of the Mark Mason degree and not the other way around, as most Masons believe. When James VI of Scotland became James I of England in 1603, one of his first acts was to confer a knighthood on Francis Bacon, who was one of his favorite thinkers as well as a fellow Freemason. 6 years later, Bacon was appointed the King's Solicitor General. The elevations continued as James went on to give Bacon the position of Attorney General, Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, and eventually Lord Chancellor in 1618, at which point he took the title Baron Verulam. Brother Bacon was one of history's finest philosophers, and he sought to purge the human mind of what he called idols or tendencies to error. He planned a large work, the Instauratio Magna, Great Restoration, laying out his ideas for the restoration of humankind's mastery over nature, which was to contain 6 parts. And we have a numbered list of those 6 parts. 1. A classification of sciences. 2. A new inductive logic. 3. A gathering of empirical and experimental facts. 3. Examples. 3. A gathering of empirical. I don't know why I read 3 again. 3 is a gathering of empirical and experimental facts. 4 is examples to show the efficacy of his new approach. 5. Generalizations derivable from natural history. 6. A new philosophy that would be a complete science of nature. Sorry about botching that up. In the end, he only managed to complete 2 parts: the Advancement of Learning in 1605, later expanded as On the Dignity and Growth of Sciences in 1623, and the New Organon, in 1620, which was an attack on Aristotle's Organon. This last work he personally presented to his patron James VI. The culmination of Bacon's work was an inductive philosophy of nature, which proposed to find the forms of natural laws of bodily action, and he devised so-called tables of induction of presence, absence, and degrees, designed to discover such forms with the goal of mastery over nature. Although Bacon could never be called a great scientist, he is highly regarded as a man that gave an impetus to the development of modern inductive science. His works were held in high esteem by diverse 17th century thinkers and scientists, including Robert Boyle, Robert Hooke, Sir Isaac Newton, and Thomas Hobbes. A century later, the great French philosophers Voltaire and Diderot, I guess is the T silent there, described this English thinker as nothing less than the father of modern science. It is highly likely that Brother Bacon was the driving force behind the styling of the new second degree introduced by his close colleague William Shaw. No one in the King's group of Freemasons had more passion for the advancement of science and the opening up of thinking about nature. Bacon, however, let his Masonic knowledge mingle with his public aspirations when he published his book, The New Atlantis, which openly spoke of his plan for a rebuilding of King Solomon's temple in spiritual terms. This pure Ezekiel-esque vision, he said, was to be, quote, a place of invention and a great temple of science, end quote. It was visualized less as a building than as a new state where the pursuit of knowledge in all its branches was to be organized in principles of the highest efficiency. In this work, the intellectual seed germ of the Constitution of the United States of America was firmly planted. The new heresy. The second or fellowcraft degree of Freemasonry gives very little knowledge to the candidate, but it does introduce the idea of hidden mysteries of nature and science, and makes a clear reference to what is called the Galilean heresy. Whilst we are certain that the central subject of this degree is as ancient as any in Freemasonry, it nonetheless is evident Sorry, I'll start that again. It nonetheless is evidently of much more recent construction, due largely to Francis Bacon. The parts that were taken for this new ceremony were concerned with nature and man's right to investigate and understand it. The whole idea of understanding the mysteries of nature seemed to us to recall the botanical encyclopedia encapsulated in the decoration of the Roslin Shrine. As we showed earlier, its finely worked carvings record details of hundreds of plants, including the impossible American varieties. Liberal thinking elsewhere had already led to the invention of a new form of heresy by the Vatican, who quite rightly saw great danger in this idea of uncontrolled thought. The Roman Catholic Church was persecuting those who investigated science and came up with conclusions which conflicted with the cardinals' dogmatic view of their scriptures. Most significant of these wicked people was Galileo, who used new techniques to confirm the view that the sun and not the earth was at the center of the universe, although this concept had been first described by the Egyptian Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BC. It was known as Copernicanism after the more recent proponent of the idea, Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. And despite all protests, the Holy Office at Rome issued an edict against Copernicanism early in 1616. The heresy referred to by Galileo and outlawed by papal bull is quoted in the answer to a paradoxical question that forms part of the ritual of passing from the first to the second degree of Freemasonry. The questions and answers go as follows. Question: where were you made a Mason? Answer: in the body of a lodge just perfect and regular. Question: and when? Answer: when the sun was at its meridian. Question: as in this country, Masons' lodges are usually held and candidates initiated at night. How do you reconcile that which at first sight appears as a paradox? Answer: the sun being a fixed body and the earth continually revolving about the same on its own axis, and Freemasonry being a universal science, diffused throughout the whole of the inhabited globe, it necessarily follows that the sun must always be at its meridian with respect to Freemasonry. End quote. This reference is unlikely to have been inserted before 1610, the date when Galileo publicly announced his conviction that Copernicus was indeed correct in thinking that the earth revolved around the sun. Francis Bacon, we believe, immediately set about incorporating this new truth of nature into his recently created second degree. It is important to remember that the fellow craft degree was not an invention. It was made from sections taken from Mark Masonry and possibly the original 2 degrees, the entrance degree and the master's rank, with some new elements added where they seemed to fit. This has given rise to a major contradiction within this ritual. The candidate is told that a secret sign is made by holding the hands in a certain way above the head, as used by Joshua. Quote, when Joshua fought the battles of the Lord in the valley of Jehoshaphat, it is in this posture that he stood and fervently prayed the Lord to stay the sun in its course and extend the light of day until he had completed the overthrow of his enemies. End quote. Um, there is an obvious contradiction in being told first that the earth goes around the sun, then that God stopped the sun going around the earth to help Joshua. We believe that story was left in because it was too old and too important to remove or change, despite the contradiction with newer material. This explanation of the fellow craft sign apparently applies to Joshua 10:12, but this verse actually refers to the valley of Ajalon, not Jehoshaphat. Joshua you will recall, was the leader of the Israelites after Moses, but it was not until the time of David that the valley of Jehoshaphat became Israelite territory, as we have already mentioned. Jehoshaphat is another name for the Kidron Valley, which runs to the south and east of Jerusalem. We discussed earlier how the Old Testament legend of Joshua depicts him as a marauding, murderous Habiru with no obvious relevance to the tenets of Freemasonry. The passage in the Old Testament to which the quotation is attributed is one of the many appalling catalogues of the mass slaughter of innocent men, women, and children for no reason other than the rapacity of such marauders as Joshua and the apparent insanity of Yahweh. The passage boasts how, on God's orders, 5 kings and all of their subjects and animals were slaughtered by the advancing Habiru, and how, from one end of the land to the other, quote, he left none remaining, but utterly destroyed all that breathed, as the Lord God of Israel commanded. End quote. And they wonder why some people consider the God of the Old Testament to be the demiurge. Anyway, since this Joshua was about as unmasonic as a person can get and predates King Solomon's temple, we cannot imagine why anyone would assume that this piece of Masonic ritual should refer to him unless they were ignorant of any other explanation. There was, however, another far more special biblical figure known by the name of Joshua or Yahoshua, who is vitally important to Freemasonry and who did fight the greatest battle of the Lord in the valley of Jehoshaphat. That man, of course, was Jesus, who stood with his supporters in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is in the valley of Jehoshaphat, where he finally confronted and sought the overthrow of his enemies, because he was aware of the ancient story of Sekenenre Tau / Hiram Abif. He is likely to have called upon God to metaphorically stay the sun at its meridian, which was a way of asking that the forces of darkness be held at their weakest and the forces of goodness be at their height for the duration of the coming conflict. Unfortunately, he lost that battle, but thanks to the Templars, he eventually won the war. This knowledge makes perfect sense out of an otherwise peculiar explanation of the fellow craft or second-degree sign. In chapter 12, we showed how James's speech at the crucifixion and his subsequent leadership of the church meant that he was deeply impressed by his brother's actions, and it is unreasonable to think that an episode as important as the prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane would not have been written down in the scrolls that the Templars discovered. James and the other Qumranians would have viewed what Jesus had done in the valley of Jehoshaphat as a picture of Joshua 10:12, and this interpretation of the second degree sign makes sense of a ritual that was previously unfathomable. The old charges. We've got quite a ways to go, but we've got a few pictures coming up. It is the old charges. It is clear that changes in the content of the old ritual were kept to a minimum, and that the old charges from the verbal tradition were first written down to ensure that deviation would not occur. William Shaw is known to have sought to protect the quote, ancient landmarks of the order, end quote, and the written evidence is available today to tell us what Masonry was about prior to the improvements ordered by James VI and carried out by Shaw, Bacon, and others. There are a number of these documents in existence. One such is in the Inigo Jones manuscript of 1607, but there is some doubt about its authorship. It has been attributed to the famous architect of Freemasonry. However, it is suggested by some experts that it could have been written as much as 50 years later, possibly by a member of the Inigo Jones Lodge. A more reliable document is the wood the Wood Manuscript, written in 1610, the same year as Galileo first declared his views on the structure of the solar system, on vellum in the form of 8 strips folded to give 16 leaves with 32 pages. It starts by identifying the sciences with which Masonry has always been associated, which are given as grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These are ancient classical subjects lost in the Christian world during the Dark Ages. They had been recognized again from the 10th century onward through contact with Arab scholars in Spain, Sicily, and North Africa, and Greek thinkers in Constantinople. Amongst other things, the lost works of Aristotle had been rediscovered. In addition, Arabic scientific and mathematical works were translated for Western use. By the beginning of the 17th century, they were again the natural subjects of all educated people and were in no way peculiar to Freemasonry. The Wood manuscript goes on to say that geometry is the greatest of the sciences and has been since the beginning of time. It traces the history of the order from 2 pillars that were found after Noah's flood, one made of a marble that would not burn with fire, the other made of a substance known in Masonic legend as laterus, which would not dissolve, sink, or drown in any water. One of these pillars was found, and upon it was inscribed the secrets of the sciences from which the Sumerians developed a moral code that passed to the Egyptians through the Sumerian Abraham and his wife Sarah. The script goes on to describe Euclid teaching geometry to the Egyptians, from whom the Israelites took it to Jerusalem, which resulted in the building of King Solomon's temple. Some of these 17th century manuscripts do not refer to Hiram Abif, which has led some to believe that the character was an invention of this relatively recent period. However, the name Hiram Abif was only one designation for this central figure. He is also referred to as Amon, Amen, Amnon, Aman, or Amen, and sometimes Benaim. It is said that Amen is said to be the Hebrew word for the trusted one or the faithful one, which fits the role of Hiram Abif perfectly. But we also know that Amon or Amen is the name of the ancient creator god of Thebes, the city of Seqenenre Tau. Could there be an ancient linkage here? We think so. The name Aman particularly interested us because it brought to mind the description of the writers of the book of Genesis in chapter 49, verse 6, which we referred to in chapter 8, that you will recall we thought could be a description of the killing of Seqenenre. Quote, O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly mine honor, but not be not thou united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self will they dig down a wall. End quote. Could it be that the apparently unnamed victim was actually named because they were referring to a man, the early Masonic name for Hiram Abif, and the name of the greater god of Thebes? And is it coincidence that Christians call on Amen at the end of their prayers in an appeal for, or Amen? Have you heard of the Amen Hillman? No, I have not. Sorry, I don't know how long ago you asked that. I was not paying attention. But I have not, no. Let's see. And is it coincidence that Christians call on Amen, or, yeah, or Amen, at the end of their prayers in an appeal to their wishes to be made true? The other name, Benaim, has caused Masonic researchers some difficulty. It has been noted that the ending im in Hebrew creates a plural, as in pesherim, while the first part is said to mean builder. We would go further and suggest that it is based on the ancient Egyptian term for a sacred pillar, which was topped by a small pyramid called a benben stone. This word could therefore be said to be a very ancient description, meaning builder of the sacred pillars. That would indeed make a whole lot of sense as a literal description of Hiram Abiff and a metaphoric one of Jesus. It seems to us that the time Freemasonry was being formalized by King James's team from the speculative/operative marriage of the Rosslyn Templars, its origins had become confused and in parts lost. These 17th century Freemasons had a direct line back to almost the beginnings of human history, but all the stages through which the motifs had now passed were obscuring much of the story. However, Amon Hillman means all roads. Okay. However, whilst they were unclear about where their order had come from, they did understand the import of the wisdom that it contained, and were invigorated by the groundswell of learning that arose in the 17th century. Freemasons were ready to take advantage. In the second degree ceremony, the candidate is asked, quote, "What are the peculiar objects of research in this degree?" End quote. The answer he is required to give is, quote, "The hidden mysteries of nature and science." End quote. On completion of the making of the new fellowcraft, he is told, quote, "You are now expected to make the liberal arts and sciences your future study." End quote. This was an invitation that the great Freemasons of the mid-17th century could not refuse. Having analyzed the 17th century developments in Freemasonry, our final task was to understand how Freemasonry went on to make its mark on the modern world. In 1625, the Freemason King James VI died, and his second son, Charles, succeeded to the throne. James's elder son, Prince Henry, had died in 1612. We felt sure that the new king would have followed in the footsteps of his father by becoming a Freemason. It is significant that a number of graves rich in Freemasonic symbolism are built into the north wall of Holyrood Abbey in Edinburgh, which he refurbished for his own Scottish coronation in 1633. However, Charles made an inauspicious start in the eyes of the Protestant majority of his people when he married Henrietta Maria, the Catholic princess daughter of King Henry IV of France. Like James, Charles was a firm believer in the divine right of kings, which he displayed with arrogance, causing conflict with Parliament and leading ultimately to civil war. The young king was strongly influenced by his close friend George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, whom he appointed to be his chief minister despite widespread disapproval. Charles remained at permanent loggerheads with his parliaments, dissolving 3 of them in just 4 years because of their refusal to comply with his arbitrary demands. When the third of these parliaments met in 1628, it presented the Petition of Right, a statement demanding that the king make certain reforms in exchange for funds. Charles was forced to accept the petition, but after making this concession, he responded by dismissing Parliament once again and had several parliamentary leaders imprisoned. Charles lacked his father's flair for political management, and his ongoing confrontation with Parliament led to a period where he reigned for 11 years without any Parliament at all. During this time, he introduced extraordinary financial measures to meet governmental expenses, which compounded his deep unpopularity. The whole kingdom started to become unstable under Charles's autocratic rule, and whilst at any other time such social upheaval could only be a bad thing, the peculiar circumstances of the time paradoxically made it a period of opportunity. New kinds of thinking Sorry. New kinds of thinking abounded, and the breakdown of the continuity of the old established order of things put all possibilities into the melting pot. It may sound odd at first hearing, but we increasingly started to feel that there are pertinent parallels between this period in 17th century England and the circumstances found in Israel at the time of Jesus and the Nazarene movement. These similarities were to make the teachings found in Freemasonry particularly relevant to all of the main groups concerned in the English Civil War. The first of these parallels concerns a conflict in the process of connecting with God. As with the Jews 1600 years earlier, virtually everyone in the country thought that God was at the center of all matters, but there was a growing diversity of opinion on the best way to relate to him. In Jesus' time, there were the Sanhedrin, who constituted the appointed authority of the temple, which was the only official route to Yahweh, and there were the Sadducees, who recognized the rule of the Roman emperor. Even the supposedly righteous Pharisees were accused by Jesus of losing sight of the very basis of their faith, and Jesus openly opposed their power. In our view, Jesus was nothing less than a Republican himself, attempting to establish the rule of the righteous people with himself as legislative leader upholding the laws of God. He was an anti-bureaucrat who wanted to remove the self-important self-seekers who claimed control of the route to God. He was undoubtedly anti-establishment, and we think it is not unreasonable to describe him as a Puritan of his time, a man who strove for simplicity, religious rigor, and freedom, and was not afraid to fight for it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic Church was run by the comfortable conservatives that had lost sight of godliness beneath their own inflated egos, and their insistence that only the Pope had the right to interface with God had worn very thin with those that had the wit and the opportunity to think for themselves. Ren Flames, hello, how are you? Welcome in. It's been a long time. Good to see you. I am doing very well. Finishing up this book tonight. We're reading the Hiram Key about the Freemasons. And yeah, enjoying it quite a lot. So, always glad to see you. I haven't caught your stream in quite a while, unfortunately, but um, we'll get back there. Okay, back to it. So, some of the criticisms of the Pharisees found in the reconstructed original gospel known as Q sound very much like the kind of accusations that the 17th century Puritans were leveling at the Roman Catholic Church. Some of the words attributed to Jesus in QS 34 of the reconstructed gospel Q struck us as being very pertinent to these later times. Okay, then we have a fairly long quote. We're coming up on one of the big pictures I was talking about. Quote, "Shame on you, Pharisees, if you clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are full of greed and incontinence. Foolish Pharisees, clean the inside, and the outside will also be clean. Shame on you, Pharisees, for you love the front seats in the assemblies and greetings in the marketplace. Shame on you, for you are like graves, outwardly beautiful, but full of pollution inside. Shame on you, lawyers, for you have taken the key of knowledge away from the people. You yourself do not enter the kingdom of God, and you prevent those who would enter from going in." End quote. I knew lawyers couldn't go to heaven. They're evil. I'm half joking. I have a strong dislike for most lawyers. I'm sure there are good ones, but How easy it would be to transpose the words Pharisees or lawyers for the word cardinals to create a passage that would sound remarkably Puritan. Our second connection between the two periods concerns the ending of papal power in England and the combining of sacerdotal and secular authority in the single figure of the king. For the first time since the establishment of the church, the ambition of Jesus to unite both priestly and kingly pillars in one was achieved. Whilst working on this appendix, we decided to look through material we had collected about the English Civil War. We came across a 17th century illustration that confirmed everything we had detected about a link with the Jerusalem church. Earlier on in our research, we had had frequent celebrations as we came across some artifact or gem of information that locked in another section of the growing picture. By this stage, however, we were starting to accept that remarkable pieces of evidence would keep cropping up because our core thesis was correct, and we were mining a continuous and endless vein of historical truth. What we found at this point was a 17th century engraving that showed in graphic detail the kingly and priestly pillars of Mishpat and Tzedek, exactly as we had perceived them from reading ancient Jewish texts. It was not just similar to the way we had come to envisage this core imagery, it was identical, or almost identical. The single real difference was the figure that was the keystone. In this version, King Charles I had assumed the role of both pillars by identifying himself as the keystone that locked them together. Here, the left-hand pillar is Tzedek in the form of the church, surmounted by the figure of truth. The right-hand pillar is Mishpat in the form of the state, surmounted by justice. Interestingly enough, Charles's son, King Charles II, was to build this design into the entrance to the Holyrood House when he built it after the Civil War in 1677. Okay, so I will now show you that illustration. Hopefully there we go. Gotta be very still or it won't focus. But there you have truth, justice, the church, and the state. And I'm not sure what the map is there. Is that supposed to be the globe or the known world at the time? Oh, no, that's just England. Yeah, that's just a map of England. I don't know how well you'll be able to see that. So this would be Ireland over here. Okay. In using this symbolism, King Charles I was following fully in the footsteps of Jesus, but the king lacked both the Jewish leader's utter brilliance and his republican clarity. Jesus had believed that when social order was run in tune with the laws given by Yahweh, there would be no need for an active high priestly role because God would act directly through his earthly king to maintain a state of shalom. In contrast, the English king simply saw a joint role for himself, with God only a distant figure. Freemasonry was passing on an ancient message that had already lost some of its original and all-important meaning. Excuse me. In England, those who sought new social order would do battle before they found a unique solution to their differences, a solution that came from the craft, and one that would ensure the continuity of the monarchy in the United Kingdom when nations around them would put their rulers to the sword. Okay, just so you know, we've got like 16 pages left. The rise of the Republicans. 3 years after Charles I came to the throne, a young commoner with Republican ideas entered Parliament as member for Huntingdon. His name was Oliver Cromwell, and his family was originally from Wales with the name Williams. They had risen from obscurity through the favor of Henry VIII's minister Thomas Cromwell, who was the uncle of Oliver's great great grandfather, and they adopted the name of their patron in recognition of his help. The newly named Cromwell family soon became prominent in the Cambridgeshire town of Huntingdon, while Oliver was born on 25 April 1599, where Oliver was born. The now well-to-do Cromwells had their son educated in a town by a leading Puritan called Thomas Beard, a man who was outspoken concerning his wish to purify the Church of England of its remaining Roman Catholic elements. Cromwell later attended the predominantly Puritan Sydney Sussex College and Cambridge University, as well as studying law in London. In August 1620, he married Elizabeth Bourchier and returned to Huntingdon to manage his father's estate and become Member of Parliament for Huntingdon some 8 years later. Over the following decade, Cromwell developed a full-blown Puritan outlook, and his personal fortunes dipped before rising again when he inherited some property in Ely from his wife's uncle. In 1640, Cromwell returned to Parliament just as the relationship between King Charles I and the Puritans reached crisis stage, and conflict became inevitable. 2 years later, on 22 August 1642, civil war broke out between the Puritan-dominated Parliament and the supporters of the king. Cromwell's astute military mind was quick to understand that religious passion could produce the fighting spirit which won battles, and he rapidly raised a regiment of headstrong cavalrymen to fight on the parliamentarian side. In the first 2 years of war, after both sides had raised armies, the Royalists, or Cavaliers as they were known, became increasing successful. I'm sure that means is supposed to be increasingly successful. After a bloody but indecisive battle at Edgehill in Warwickshire in October 1642, the Royalists looked as though they would advance on London, but were successfully driven back. At the end of the first year of war, the Royalists held most parts of England except London and the eastern side of the country. Cromwell's ability as a fine commander was recognized, and by 1644 the single-minded soldier was a lieutenant general under Edward Montague, Earl of Manchester. His promotion was well deserved. He led the parliamentary forces known as Roundheads to victory in the crucial battle of Marston Moor, earning for himself and his regiment the name Ironsides. This victory proved to be something of a turning point for the parliamentarians, and the Royalists were again defeated by Sir Thomas Fairfax's new model army at Naseby in Leicestershire. I'm sure I butchered that. Sorry. Battle after battle went the way of the Roundheads until the Royalist capital, Oxford, fell on 24 June 1646, and Charles, who had surrendered himself to the Scots, was turned over to Parliament and became a prisoner. The Staffordshire town of Lichfield held out for a few weeks, but the first and most important part of the Civil War was over. Many observers believe that Oliver Cromwell was a Freemason himself, and whilst no definitive record still exists to prove this contention, it does seem extremely likely. Certainly his superior and close friend Sir Thomas Fairfax was a member of the craft, and the Fairfax's family seat in Ilkley, Yorkshire, still has a Masonic temple off the library, which is entered down a spiral stairway leading into a black and white paved room with two freestanding pillars. The building today is a corporate headquarters for a large firm of electrical contractors, but a few miles away in the village of Guiseley, there is still a lodge named Fairfax. One of the best sources of information about Freemasonry during this period was the diary of Elias Ashmole, of Elias Ashmole, a formidable tome running to 6 volumes of diary and a further volume of index. The librarian at Roberts University Library was surprised when he took out all 7 volumes over one summer with a view to reading the whole diary. We had discussed how to find out about the period and had come to the view that it was the period of the great diarists. Reading them would be a way to find out about the times. We did not know that what we were looking for, so it was necessary to read everything to see what was there. This was not a wasted exercise because we found references to some very odd meetings which helped throw light onto the events which led to the formation of the Royal Society and the Restoration. Elias Ashmole from the King's was the King's Controller of Ordnance at wow, sorry. I'll start that again. Elias Ashmole was the King's Controller of I must be getting tired. Elias Ashmole was the King's Controller of Ordnance at Oxford at the time of the surrender, and he is also one of the most important figures in the official history of Freemasonry. 4 months after he saw his side lose the war, Ashmole traveled to Warrington to be initiated into the craft. His diary entry for 16 October 1646 reads, quote, Lancashire, with Cole, Henry Mainwaring of Carensham in Cheshire. The names of those that were then of the lodge, Mr. Rich Penkett, Warden, Mr. James Collier, Mr. Rich Sankey, Henry Littler, John Elam, Rich, Elam and Hugh Brewer. Kind of hard to read because there are some weird spots where he's got colons in there. I don't know. Anyway, traveling from Oxford to Warrington in those days must have been a long and arduous journey, yet the very next day after his initiation, Ashmole set out again, this time to the parliamentary stronghold of London. This was a strange thing to do because tension was still high and all ex-royalist officers were banned from coming within 20 miles of the city of London. As he had so recently served as the King's Controller of Ordnance, Ashmole could not hope to go unrecognized. So he must have had good reason to go there and must also have had some guarantee of protection. A note dated 14 May 1650 in the papers of the Public Record Office, State Papers Domestic Interregnum A, confirms the unusual nature of the visit and that it was not a temporary arrangement. Quote, he, Ashmole, doth make his abode in London notwithstanding the Act of Parliament to the contrary. End quote. There is a good reason to suppose that this royalist Freemason was able to live openly in London for many years and that he consorted with high-ranking parliamentarians. There can be little doubt that this was due to the fact that he was a Freemason, and therefore a member of the only non-religious, non-political organization that provided a fraternal structure in which Cavalier could meet Roundhead and Catholic could meet Puritan without fear and without malice. Once again, Ashmole's diary provided us with valuable information. The entry for 17 June 1652 reads, quote, IIH.A.M, and don't know what that stands for. Dr. Wilkins and Mr. Wren came to visit me at Blackfriars. This was the first time I saw the doctor. End quote. IIHAM. I don't recognize H as a Roman numeral. If it is, it's one I'm not familiar with. Anyway, moving on. Hello. The Mr. Wren referred to is the great architect Sir Christopher Wren, who built many fine churches, including St. Paul's Cathedral, after the city of London was largely destroyed in the Great Fire of 1666. Wren may have been a Freemason, but there is no evidence to support the idea, and some that suggests that he was not. Dr. Wilkins, on the other hand, was not was most definitely a member of the craft. At the time of this meeting, John Wilkins was warden of Wadham College, Oxford. Wren was a fellow of the same college at that time, but he later became Bishop of Chester and a founder member of the Royal Society. Wilkins was a parliamentarian supporter and a Puritan of considerable seniority, being the husband of Oliver Cromwell's sister Robina, and a past chaplain to Cromwell himself. By the time that Ashmole met Wilkins, he had been in London for 6 years, and much had happened. The king had renewed the war with the help of the Scots, but had been defeated and taken prisoner at Preston, and a Freemason king finally lost to a Freemason parliamentarian. On 20 January 1649, Charles I was put on trial in Westminster Hall in London. The king refused to recognize the legality of the court and did not enter a plea in response to the charges of being a tyrant, murderer, and an enemy of the nation, and a week later he was sentenced to death and publicly beheaded on 30 January. With the monarchy gone and England under his control, Cromwell's first task was the subjugation of Ireland and Scotland. The massacres following his capture of Drogheda and Wexford were terrible and excessive, the result of his burning hatred for both the Irish and for Roman Catholics. The name of Oliver Cromwell still evokes fear and anger in Ireland 350 years after the event. Scotland was a focus of Cromwell's wrath, where he destroyed royalist castles and Catholic churches wherever he found the opportunity. As we saw earlier, the Masonic shrine at Roslin was known for what it was to both Cromwell and General George Monk, and therefore survived the war intact. Despite Cromwell's talent for violence, his main success was in maintaining relative peace and stability, and paradoxically, his provision of a framework that allowed a measure of religious toleration. Whilst he had no love of Catholics, he allowed Jews, who had been excluded from England since 1290, to return in 1655, an action born out of his knowledge of Masonic ritual. Cromwell's vigorous foreign policy and the achievements of his army and navy gave England a prestige abroad that it had not enjoyed for over half a century. With the beheading of Charles, the throne of England was abandoned, and the country became the world's first parliamentary republic in a period known as the Commonwealth. The following year, the dead king's son, Charles, landed in Scotland to continue the war. In 1651, he was crowned king of that country and promptly invaded England. The new parliamentarian regime was too well established and organized to be upset by this bold but underplanned attack, and Charles was soundly defeated at Worcester. He was lucky to be able to slip away to France. Throughout this tumultuous time, the ex-controller of ordnance for the old king was living untroubled in Cromwell's London, and consorting with some of the most intelligent and influential men from both sides. Ashmole obviously had permission from the highest level to pursue a mission that transcended mere politics, and whilst what he was building was fully derived from Freemasonry, it was developing into something very new and very important. Ashmole became the friend and acquaintance of astrologers, mathematicians, physicians, and other individuals who were advancing their knowledge into the hidden mysteries of nature and science, as Francis Bacon's redefined second degree of Freemasonry required them to do. The word was out. There was an invisible college, a society of scientists that could not be identified as a group, but whose presence was very evident. Cromwell died a natural death on 3 September 1658 and was interned in Westminster Abbey. His son Richard, whom he had named as his successor, was weak and failed to retain his power. The country quickly drifted toward anarchy, but the slide was halted by the commander of the army in Scotland, General George Monk, who marched into London with his troops in May 1660. He recalled the Long Parliament and had them restore the monarchy by placing Charles II on the throne. The new king did not take long to seek revenge on the man who had caused him so much pain. He had Cromwell's body disinterred and his rotting corpse hanged as a traitor before his head was put on a pole mounted above Westminster Hall. Jeez, dude. The Royal Society emerges. The change back to a monarchy from a republic may well have been welcomed by Ashmole on a personal level, but it also brought benefit to the Invisible College. In 1662, King Charles II granted a royal warrant to it, thereby creating the Royal Society, the world's first assembly of scientists and engineers dedicated to understanding the wonders created by the, quote, great architect of the universe, end quote. The freedoms built into the fabric of Freemasonry had first created a fledgling republic, and when they failed, they gave birth to the organization that would push the boundaries of human knowledge forward to create an age of enlightenment and lay the foundations for the industrialized society of the 19th and 20th centuries. The brief spell that England spent as a republic was not wasted. Monarchs from then onwards forgot the primitive notion of the divine right to rule and held office through the affection of the people and the authority of the House of Commons, which spoke for the democratic will of the nation. In years to come, that democratic right spread to poor people and eventually women. The vision of the man called Jesus took a long time coming. At this point of our search, we had no doubt that Freemasonry carries the seed of the mind of the Nazarenes, and most particularly Jesus, and equally we can be sure that the Royal Society germinated from the hothouse of thinking that was released by Bacon's definition of the second degree of Freemasonry, well before people such as Ashmole and Wilkins pieced it all back together after the traumas of the Civil War. John Wallis, the eminent 17th century mathematician, writing about his recollections of the beginning of the Royal Society, said, quote, I take its first ground and foundation to have been in London about the year 1645, if not sooner, when Dr. Wilkins, then chaplain to the Prince Elector Palatine in London, and others met weekly at a certain day and hour under a certain penalty and a weekly contribution for the charge of experiments with certain rules agreed amongst us, when, to avoid diversion to other discourses and for some other reasons, we barred all discourses of divinity, of state affairs, and of news other than what concerned our business of philosophy. End quote. This description of the earliest meetings of the New Thinkers is unquestionably Masonic. The weekly meeting at a known hour, the known penalty, and the utter abstinence from all topics of politics and religion are still the hallmarks of a Freemason's lodge. This indiscretion of Wallis's was corrected by the Masonic hierarchy and the early Royal Society, who commissioned Spratt to write the official history of the Royal Society, which made no mention of the Masonic rules which Wallis had incautiously revealed. One of the most influential scientists to be involved with Ashmole was Robert Hooke, who was appointed the Royal Society's first curator of experiments. His prolific experiments, demonstrations, and discourses over the next 15 years were a strong factor in the Society's survival during its early period. Hooke was one of the 3 city surveyors after the first fire of London, and he was an early proponent of the microscope for biological investigations, coining the modern biological usage of the word cell. The great men of the age all sought to join the Royal Society, and perhaps the greatest of them all was Sir Isaac Newton, who achieved many things, including a remarkably detailed analysis of the gravitational structure of the universe. In 1672, Newton was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, and later that same year he published his first scientific paper on his new theory of light and color in the Philosophical Transactions of the Society. A quarter of a century after the Royal Society had been awarded its royal warrant, Newton published the Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, or Principia as it is universally known. This remarkable work is, by common consent, the greatest scientific book ever written. Whilst virtually all of the early members of the Royal Society were Masons, as time moved on, Freemasons appear to have taken something of a back seat to its new offspring because the gatherings of the intelligentsia no longer needed the secrecy and the protection of the craft to overcome religious and political obstacles. The new society took up a great deal of the time and energy of Elias Ashmole, Robert Moray, recorded as being the first man initiated into Freemasonry on English soil in 1641, John Wilkins, Robert Hooke, and Christian Wren, who was made president in 1681. It is very clear from these well-documented facts that Freemasons had established the Royal Society and that the focus on the reconstructed second degree had served its purpose and moved the world forward into a new scientific age. During Sir Isaac Newton's presidency some years later, a well-known senior French Freemason by the name of Chevalier Ramsay was made a member of the Royal Society despite a lack of any scientific credentials, with most of the foremost intellects of Freemasonry devoting their time and energy to the new society. It seems that the craft in London was suffering from a certain amount of neglect. Freemasonry finds its feet. By the year 1717, Freemasonry in the London area was at a very low ebb. There were only 4 lodges meeting regularly. The Goose and Gridiron in St. Paul's Churchyard, the Crown in Parker Lane near Drury Lane, the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden, the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. There can be no doubt that the craft in London was suffering from a crisis of loss of traditional identity. Why did it still need to exist? Freemasonry was suddenly a victim of its own success. It had overcome the long-standing threat from the church, and had kick-started democracy and a climate of ongoing scientific inquiry. Around the rest of the country, however, Masonic lodges were starting to become regular and were increasingly popular. A Grand Lodge, formed at some unknown time before 1705, had been meeting regularly in York, and this first Grand Lodge was continually supported by members of the nobility. Claimed the title Grand Lodge of all England, something had to be done in London, and so the 4 lodges listed above met at the Apple Tree Tavern in February 1717 and voted the most senior Mason present into the chair of the meeting. This senior Mason does not seem to have been named anywhere in the literature, but the gathering certainly resolved to call a full meeting of all 4 lodges at the Goose and Gridiron to be held on 24 June for the purpose of electing a Grand Master to govern the entire order. Accordingly, on St. John the Baptist's Day the same year, the assembly and feast was held, and Mr. Anthony Sayer was elected first Grand Master for the ensuing year. It is interesting to note that at this time they chose a Grand Master from amongst themselves, quote, until such a time as they should have the honor of a noble brother at their head, end quote. This could well be a reference to the fact that Scottish Freemasonry claimed a noble brother as Grand Master from the time of the first St. Clair Charter in 1601. The new English Grand Lodge drew up a number of regulations. Quote, that the privilege of assembling as Masons, which had hitherto been unlimited, should be vested in certain lodges or assemblies of Masons convened in certain places, and that every lodge hereafter convened except the 4 old lodges at this time existing should be legally authorized to act by a warrant from the Grand Master for the time being, granted to certain individuals by petition, with consent and approbation of the Grand Lodge in communication, and that without such warrant no lodge should be hereafter deemed regular or constitutional, that every privilege which they collectively enjoyed by virtue of their immemorial rights they should still continue to enjoy, and that no law, rule, or regulation to be hereafter made or passed in Grand Lodge should derive, I think it's supposed to be deprive, them of such privilege or encroach on any landmark which was at that time established as the standard of Masonic government. The necessity of fixing the original constitutions as the standard by which all future laws in the society are to be regulated was so clearly understood by the whole fraternity at this time that it was established as an unerring rule at every installation, public and private, to make the Grand Master and the masters and wardens of every lodge engage to support their constituent constitutions, to which also every Mason was bound by the strongest ties at initiation. End quote. And it almost seems like that whole last paragraph of that was not supposed to be part of the quote, but maybe it was. By forming a Grand Lodge under the control of an elected Grand Master, the 4 lodges had effectively set up a control system for Masonry which ensured that only they were exempt from its dictates, but all other Masons had to conform to its edicts. They could declare a lodge to be regular or have it struck off the list of regular lodges. Their right to do this was challenged by other Masons, particularly those in York, who did not accept London's self-appointed mission to ensure that no new heretics emerged who did not agree with the regular and approved heresy of the order. In order to formalize itself as a regular institution, English Freemasonry was already starting to lose its way. Nonetheless, the new structure did pull everything together after a long period of infighting, and the higher echelons of the craft were slowly taken over by the royal family, who sought to maintain their influence in the most republican organization in the world. This linking of Freemasonry and the royal family has, in our opinion, been the main reason for the survival of the British monarchy. We're getting there. A few pages left. Bear with me. We have constructed a list of English past Grand Masters, and the gravitation toward the aristocracy and the royal family is clear to see, and that is Appendix 3. When this list is compared with the record of Scottish past Grand Masters, which is Appendix 4, it is clear that from its earliest records, Scottish Freemasonry has been closely associated with the lords of the realm as well as with the humblest of working stonemasons, a tradition still proudly held in Scotland to this day. The craft soon spread throughout the world. It is the fundamental influence of Freemasonry on the American and French revolutions combined with the tendency of Scottish Freemasons to support the Jacobite cause that was finally responsible for the Hanoverian kings of England adopting the craft as their own. In 1782, 4 years after the Declaration of Independence in the United States, the Duke of Clarence, brother to George II, became Grand Master. In the year of the French Revolution, 1789, the Prince of Wales and his 2 brothers were initiated into the craft, and within a year the Prince of Wales was Grand Master and received loyal addresses from Masons throughout the world, including George Washington, at the time Master of Alexandria Lodge No. 22 on the roll of the Grand Lodge of New York, and also from many French lodges. By this means the Hanoverian kings used the the Masonic system to offer a democratic reason for keeping the loyalty of their Masonic subjects. Masonry in England was now well on the way to becoming the social and dining club that it is today, and was starting to lose sight of its original heritage. Its true secrets were indeed becoming lost. The spread of Freemasonry. Soon after the formation of the London Grand Lodge, the second Grand Master, George Payne, collected many manuscripts on the subject of Masonry, including copies of the ancient charges. In 1720, it was resolved to publish the Book of Constitutions, and at this time it is claimed that a number of valuable old manuscripts, quote, were burnt too hastily by some scrupulous brethren, end quote, rather than have them fall into the hands of an opposing element within the order known as the Moderns. It is claimed that the original of the Inigo Jones copy of the ancient charges was lost at this point. In the same year, it was agreed in future the new Grand Master should be named before the annual meeting, and that every Grand Master, when installed, should have the sole power of appointing his deputy and wardens. In 1724, the then Grand Master, the Duke of Richmond, set up the first committee of charity to provide a general fund for the relief of distressed Masons. This had previously been suggested by his predecessor, the Duke of Buccleuch. I'm not sure. This seems to be the first recorded instance of a Masonic organization for charity, which is so important to modern Freemasonry. In January 1723, after only 9 months in office, the Duke of Montague resigned as Grand Master in favor of the Duke of Wharton, who was so keen to become Grand Master that he had even tried to get himself elected at an irregular meeting of Masons. By now the regular succession of lords of the realm had been established and was to continue. The sorts of common men who had been early Grand Masters never again held that office, or indeed the position of Deputy Grand Master. Nobles of lesser noble rank took that role, carrying out the Grand Master's administrative work. The growing organization was in need of secondary centers of administration, and in 1727 the office of Provincial Grand Master was instituted as a means of assisting the rule of the greatly increased and geographically extended craft. On 10 May 1727, Hugh Warburton was installed as the first provincial Grand Master, his province being North Wales, and on 24 June 1727, Sir Edward Mansell, Bart, was installed as provincial Grand Master for South Wales. Also in 1727, the first recorded warrant for an overseas lodge was issued by the London Grand Lodge to Gibraltar, closely followed by permission to hold a lodge in St. Bernard's Street, Madrid. Freemasonry was spreading like wildfire, and by 1728 the London Grand Lodge started to establish itself in the future British Empire, as a deputation was granted to George Pomfret to establish a lodge in Bengal. The scope of the provincial control of the craft was increased with the appointment of provincial Grand Masters for Lower Saxony, New Jersey in America, and Bengal. In 1730, the first Prince of the Royal Blood was initiated. Francis, Duke of Lorraine, Grand Duke of Tuscany, later to become Emperor of Germany, was initiated by the Earl of Chesterfield at a special lodge convened at the Hague. The Duke received the first two degrees of Masonry and was later raised to the third degree at the house of Sir Robert Walpole, at a lodge again chaired by the Earl of Chesterfield. In the same year the range of foreign Masonry was further extended by the granting of deputations to form lodges in Russia, Spain, Paris, and Flanders. By now the order was fast becoming a stylish dining club for the nobility, and in 1730 they held their first country meeting of the jurisdiction of London at Hampstead on 24 June, for which purpose cards of invitation were sent to several of the nobility. By 1733, there were 53 lodges represented at the annual communication of Grand Lodge, so the range of power and influence of the London Grand Lodge was growing. At this 1733 meeting, several new regulations were confirmed concerning the operations of the Charity Committee, including the right to hear its own complaints before any were brought before Grand Lodge. We're almost there. Almost. At the same meeting, a collection was taken to be distributed amongst distressed Masons and to encourage them in the founding of a new colony in Georgia. During the year, deputations were granted to open lodges in Hamburg and in Holland. In 1738, James Anderson, and then Grand Secretary, the then Grand Secretary, published a revised Book of Constitutions. It is this work on the history of the craft which has caused some authors to attribute to him the creation of craft masonry. At about this time, regulations were introduced to the effect that if a lodge ceased to meet for more than 12 months, then it would be erased from the list and lose its seniority. It was also fixed at this time that all future grandmasters would be elected from the Grand Steward's Lodge to encourage gentlemen to serve the office, while resolutions were passed concerning what were described as illegal conventions of Masons. This removed the democratic right of the brethren to elect whom they saw fit to rule them. The territory of the Grand Lodge of York was encroached upon by the warranting of lodges in Lancashire, Durham, and Northumberland, which reportedly caused all friendly intercourse to cease between the two Grand Lodges. By this time, warrants had been issued to hold lodges in Aubigny in France, Lisbon, Savannah in Georgia, in South America, Gambia, West Africa. What? Anyway, provincial grandmasters had been appointed to New England, South Carolina, and Cape Coast Castle in Africa. During the year 1737, Dr. Desaguliers, I have no idea how to pronounce that, um, part Grand Master 1719, initiated Frederick, Prince of Wales, at a lodge convened for the purpose at Kew later in the same year, passing him to the second degree and then raising him to the sublime degree of a Master Mason. At the communication of Grand Lodge, 60 lodges were represented, and provincial Grand Masters were appointed for Montserrat, Geneva, the coast of Africa, New York, and the islands of America. Yeah, it's getting there. My voice is about done, but I've got like 3 pages left, 4 pages, and then we're done with this book. So keep on trucking. In 1738, two further provinces came into being, the Caribbean islands and the province of Yorkshire, West Riding, which was considered yet another encroachment on the rights of the Grand Lodge of York. This widened the original breach between the two Grand Lodges and resulted in a total breakdown of relations. On 15 August 1738, the Scottish Grand Lodge scored a major victory in the quest for seniority amongst the Grand Lodges by initiating Frederick the Great of Prussia at a lodge held in Brunswick for the purpose. Frederick went on to set up a Grand Lodge in Berlin under the Scottish Constitution. Development of Masonry in America. And then we're almost done. We're almost done. This is the last section. We had now reached the recorded history of the craft, and in a way our quest was complete, but we still had an outstanding curiosity about the long-term fate of the land and the star of America. To complete our picture, we decided to look briefly at the development of the United States of America. It is no secret that Masonry was a major moving force behind the American Revolution and the founding of the Republic of the United States of America. The anti-British tax demonstration known as the Boston Tea Party was organized in 1773 by the members of the St. Andrew's Lodge, which had amongst its members such famous individuals as Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. The lodge, which met at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, did not itself organize the Tea Party, but its members founded a club called the Casus Pro Bono Publico, of which Joseph Warren, the master of the lodge, later to become Grand Master of Massachusetts, which was a major force. Henry Perquet is reported to have said that he was present at the Tea Party as a spectator and in disobedience to the master of St. Andrew's Lodge, who was actively present. The men who created the United States of America were either Freemasons themselves or had close contact with Freemasons. They used the thinking that had developed in Britain during the previous century as the building blocks of their own constitution. They did not know it, but by their devotion to Masonic principles of justice, truth, and equality for their new country, they were undertaking an attempt to build a land that would be driven by a rediscovered Ma'at, a modern state that was the genuine heir to the greatness of ancient Egypt. In some ways, the architects of the United States did succeed, but in all too many ways, they have so far failed. It took a terrible civil war to end the enslavement of the southern black population, and even today in many states the word equality is still an aspiration of reasonable people and an irrelevance to the unreasonable. Like Freemasonry itself, the United States is an imperfect ideal that deserves to win, but has the failing of being made up of mere mortals. Of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence on 4 July 1778, the following were Masons: William Hooper, Benjamin Franklin, Matthew Thornton, William Whipple, John Hancock, Philip Livingston, and Thomas Nelson. It was said at the time that with just 4 men out of the room, the assembly that remained was more than enough to hold a Masonic lodge of the 3rd degree. It could also have allowed in most of the army leaders. Leading Freemasons were included such men as Greene, Marion, Sullivan, Rufus, Putnam, Edwards, Jackson, Gist, Baron Steuben, Baron de Kalb, the Marquis de Lafayette, and George Washington himself. When Washington was sworn into office as the first president of the Republic on 30 April 1789, it was by the Grand Master of New York, and he took his oath on the Masonic Bible, which was normally used as the volume of the Sacred Law of St. John's Lodge, No. 1, on the roll of the Grand Lodge of New York. He had been a Freemason all his adult life, being initiated into the Fredericksburg Masonic Lodge 5 months before his 21st birthday, on February 4th, November 1752. As his mother lodge met on the first Friday of the month, he was passed to the 2nd degree on 3 March 1753 and raised to the sublime degree of a Master Mason on 4 August 1753 in the same lodge. At the time of his initiation he had just completed surveying the Virginian estates of Lord Fairfax, whose forebear had introduced Oliver Cromwell to Freemasonry. The Fairfax family were very active Freemasons in the Grand Lodge of York, and his elder brother Lawrence, with whom George was living at the time, had been educated in England and was married to Lord Fairfax's niece. The lodge that Washington attended probably followed an ad hoc York Rite lodge rather than a Scottish Rite, but 6 years after his initiation, in 1758, Fredericksburg Lodge received a charter from Scottish Grand Lodge, which formalized its position. When Washington was made first president of the United States of America, he had been a member of the craft for almost 36 years, and was at the time a member of Alexandria's Lodge No. 22. Searching through old manuscripts, we came across a contemporary record of George Washington's speech after being presented with an inscribed Book of Constitutions by the Freemasons of Boston on 27 October 1792. From the date of the presentation, we assume this must have been to celebrate his 40 years in the craft. We show it here in the form we found it, complete with the use of a letter S that looks like a modern F. It reads, flattering as it may be to the quote, almost there. We're almost. We got a page. Flattering as it may be to the human mind, and truly honorable as it is to receive from our fellow citizens testimonies of approbation for exertions to promote the public welfare, it is not less pleasing to know that the milder virtues of the heart are highly respected by a society whose liberal principles are founded in the immutable laws of truth and justice. To enlarge the sphere of social happenings is worthy the benevolent design of a Masonic institution, and it is most fervently to be wished that the conduct of every member of the fraternity, as well as those publications that discover the principles which actuate them, may tend to convince mankind that the grand object of Masonry is to promote the happenings of the human race. While I beg your acceptance of my thanks for the Book of Constitutions which you have sent me, and for the honor you have done me in the dedication, permit me to assure you that I feel all those emotions of gratitude which your affectionate addresses, and cordial wishes are calculated to inspire, and I sincerely pray that the great architect of the universe may bless you here and receive you hereafter in his immortal temple. End quote. And the finale. It was also in 1792 that Washington laid the foundation stone of the White House on 13 October, the anniversary of Dumoulint's crucifixion. That would be Jacques Dumoulin, the last um, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. That year, the dollar was adopted as the unit of currency for the United States of America. The symbol for the dollar is an S with a double vertical strike through, although in print it more usually appears today with a single vertical line. The S was borrowed from an old English coin, but the two I'm sorry, I read English and it says Spanish. Wow, I am tired. It was borrowed from an old Spanish coin, but the two vertical lines were the Nazarene pillars of Mishpat and Tzedek, rather better known to the Masonic founders of the United States as Boaz and Yakin, the pillars of the porchway to King Solomon's temple. Today the dollar bill bears the image of a pyramid with an eye set within it, which is the most ancient of all images in daily use because it has come down to us from before the time of Seqenenre Tao, escaping the purge of Egyptian motifs of the king-making ceremony caused by the prophet Ezekiel during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. It represents God in the form of Amun-Re, having an ever-present eye, casting his gaze over his people to judge every action they make in life, so that they will receive their just deserts in death. The whole basis of Ma'at was a measurement of the goodness done in life as seen by God on the obverse of the $1 bill is sorry, I strung those together. On the obverse of the $1 bill is Brother George Washington, and on the now defunct $2 bill there was the image of another famous Freemason, Brother Benjamin Franklin. And then there's one tiny little blurb here about Washington. And then we are done with this book. On 18 September 1793, George Washington laid the cornerstone of the Capitol building in Washington, and he along with fellows were all dressed in their full Masonic regalia. The United States of America is still a very young country. To match the longevity of ancient Egypt, it will have to maintain its powerful status until at least AD 4500. And to match that country's first great peak, it still has some 400 years to go. But we suspect that the Masonic experiment that found its home in the cosmopolitan land across the ocean to the west will find a far greater conclusion, because it is only another stepping stone on a journey set in motion in southern Iraq at least 6,000 years ago. And that is that. The rest of the appendices are just the past masters of the different lodges, of the grand lodges, um, and then sort of a timeline starting in 28,000 BC, chronologically all the way through to 1991, when they first published the Dead Sea Scrolls. Otherwise, there's just a couple of maps, which I can show you real quick, and then we'll just call this one a done deal. So this first map is of Egypt, and it shows Egypt showing the twin pillars, the pillars being representations of northern and southern Egypt, or upper and lower Egypt, I should say. Um, and it shows Sinai and the Red Sea and all that. So I will show you that, and hopefully it will be readable. Let me get it a little closer so it's a little more readable. So you can see, oh, can I, nope, I'm not there. Wrong hand. Whoop, going the wrong way. There's the one. That's Upper Egypt is actually the southern part of Egypt, if you didn't know that. And there, just above my finger, is the one pillar, and then the other one is kind of obvious up at the top. It stands out more. And it's Upper Egypt is in the south because the Nile runs south to north. A lot of people don't realize that. The second is Mesopotamia. It's the Tigris and Euphrates, the land in between. So Sumeria, land of Sumer. So the whole first part of the book was all about that part of the world, because they were tracing um, the Jews and their captivity and Moses and all of that. So, and then we have Herod's temple showing up in the map of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. So you'll see right up here is Herod's temple. Upper city, lower city, there, Kidron Valley. So what they were saying earlier um, is the geography around Rosslyn Chapel very closely matches the geography of Jerusalem and where Herod's temple was. And that's that. That's the last of the maps. We just have an index after that, and I sure as heck am not going to read an index. So we made it. Woo! It was a good book. I read it once about 20 years ago and didn't remember a bit of it this long into my life. So, but anyway, yeah, that's that. I am going to be. I've already picked out the next book I'm reading, and it is on Hollow Earth. So that one should be an interesting read. Um, Take it with a grain of salt, or believe it wholeheartedly. Take it to heart, whichever you choose. I'm just reading a book, but it sounds like it's going to be a good read. Um, so we will be starting that on Friday. So thank everybody for coming in. Thank you, Run Flames, Always glad to see you, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a good night.
Feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. So tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not much luck I've had, but more sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places. I'm giving up. So it's in my head. sophisticated into love relations. Now disassembling my own heart, 'cause my mind's a million places and giving up. So it's in my head. Just tell me it's not happening. Tell me it's not happening. Surrender myself. I feel the world collapsing, but feeling shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace.